There's a kind of tiredness that doesn't show up on your face. It doesn't make you cry in public, or miss work, or fall apart in obvious ways. It's quieter than that. It settles into your body slowly, like background noise you stop noticing until the silence feels unfamiliar. You still wake up on time. You still answer messages. You still do what's expected. But somewhere along the way, life starts to feel thinner, like you're touching it through glass. That was the kind of tired he carried. Not broken. Not dramatic. Just worn down in places no one could see. Most nights looked the same. The apartment stayed clean because routine gave him control. The job stayed steady because reliability had always been his strength. He rinsed the same mug in the sink, sometimes realizing halfway through that he didn't remember making the coffee in the first place. He'd stare out the window, not searching for anything specific, just pausing, as if the quiet outside might explain the heaviness inside. Nothing was wrong. And somehow that felt like the problem. He told himself he should be grateful. People would trade places with him without hesitation. He had peace. Stability. A life that didn't demand too much. But the longer he lived inside that calm, the more it felt like he was holding his breath without meaning to. Comfortable. Safe. Emotionally untouched. This is the part no one warns you about. How comfort can slowly turn into numbness. How stability can quietly replace desire. How a life that doesn't hurt can still leave you unfulfilled. He wasn't unhappy. He just wasn't fully present in his own life anymore. And because nothing was visibly wrong, he never thought to question it. That's how emotional fatigue works. It doesn't announce itself. It convinces you to stay still. It teaches you that wanting more is unnecessary, even dangerous. It whispers that peace is enough. That longing is a problem you've already outgrown. So he stayed where he was. In the routines. In the quiet. In the belief that love, when it came, should fit neatly into the life he'd already built, without asking him to change. He didn't know yet that this way of living would shape the way he loved. Or that it would cost him something he wouldn't recognize as precious, until it was already gone. And then, in the middle of that quiet season, when he was tired but didn't think he had the right to be, someone stepped into his life without noise or urgency, not as a disruption, but as a mirror. He didn't think of himself as lonely. Lonely felt too dramatic, too exposed. Loneliness belonged to people who didn't have plans on weekends or anyone to text when something small happened. He had acquaintances, co-workers, familiar faces. His calendar wasn't empty. His phone wasn't silent. But connection isn't measured by proximity. It's measured by presence. And presence was the thing that felt hardest lately. He moved through his days on autopilot, efficient and polite. Conversations stayed on safe ground. He listened more than he spoke, nodded at the right moments, laughed when expected. People liked him because he made things easy. He didn't bring complications into rooms. He didn't demand emotional labor. He fit. Fitting had always been his quiet skill. As a kid, he learned early that being low maintenance kept things calm. When emotions ran high around him, he softened his own. When conflict surfaced, he absorbed it. Over time, steadiness became more than a trait. It became an identity. He was the reliable one. The grounded one. The one who didn't need much. That belief followed him into adulthood. Needing less felt like maturity. Wanting more felt selfish. So when dissatisfaction crept in, he didn't question it. He rationalized it. Told himself everyone felt this way eventually. That adulthood was about learning to be content with what you had, instead of chasing feelings that never lasted. He called it peace. But peace, when it's real, doesn't make you feel distant from yourself. Some evenings, he'd sit on the couch long after the television stopped holding his attention. The screen would glow, the room quiet, and he'd feel a strange pressure in his chest, not sharp, not painful, just heavy, like something unspoken, waiting to be acknowledged. He never named it. Naming things gives them power, and power to him meant disruption. There's a subtle lesson life teaches people like him. If you can endure quietly, you don't have to change. So he endured. He told himself that love, if it came, would slide easily into this life. It would be calm. Predictable. It wouldn't demand emotional excavation or uncomfortable conversations. It would feel familiar, like a well-worn chair you sink into at the end of the day. That expectation mattered more than he realized. Because the way we imagine love often determines the way we show up for it. He believed love should be restful. He didn't yet understand that love also asks for movement. On weekends he volunteered at the community garden, mostly because it made the hours feel purposeful without being demanding. The work was physical enough to quiet his thoughts, solitary enough to keep him from explaining himself. Pulling weeds, turning soil, restoring something neglected, it all made sense in a way his inner life didn't. He liked early mornings there. Fewer people. Less conversation. Just the sound of tools against dirt and the rhythm of effort without expectation. That's where the quiet season of his life began to shift. Not with a grand entrance. Not with sparks or urgency. But with another person choosing the same stillness for reasons entirely her own. He noticed her the way you notice someone who doesn't interrupt the atmosphere. She moved carefully, attentively, as if listening to her body instead of forcing it forward. She didn't rush. Didn't fill silence with noise. When she worked fully. When she paused without apology. It unsettled him. Not because she did anything wrong, but because her presence made him aware of his own detachment. She hummed while she worked. Softly. Absent-mindedly. Not for attention. Just enough sound to remind the space she was alive inside it. He found himself listening without meaning to, grounding himself in that quiet rhythm. They exchanged a few words. Polite. Neutral. Safe. And yet, when the morning ended, he felt something unfamiliar. Lightness. As if the weight he'd been carrying had shifted slightly, not lifted, just noticed. That awareness followed him home. He tried to dismiss it. Attraction, he told himself, was overrated. People confused novelty with meaning all the time. He wasn't interested in disruption. He wanted calm. Continuity. Something that wouldn't ask him to confront the parts of himself he'd carefully organized away. Still, the next weekend, he arrived early again. So did she. And something about that coincidence felt intentional, even if neither of them named it. What he didn't realize, what most people don't realize in moments like this, was that reflection doesn't always show you who you want to be. Sometimes it shows you who you've been avoiding. And as their paths began to overlap in small, unremarkable ways, the quiet life he had protected so carefully was about to be tested. Not by chaos, but by clarity. He didn't talk about that morning to anyone. Not because it felt secret, but because it didn't feel explainable. Nothing happened, technically. No long conversation, no exchanged numbers. No moment you could point to and say, this is where things changed. Yet something had shifted. As the week unfolded, he caught himself thinking about the garden more than usual. About the soil under his fingernails. About the sound of humming carried on the air. About the way silence had felt different when it was shared instead of endured. That unsettled him. He preferred clarity, defined causes and effects. Emotional ambiguity made him uneasy, so he treated it the same way he treated most discomfort, by minimizing it. He told himself it was just a pleasant distraction, that people noticed each other all the time without it meaning anything. Still, he arrived early again the following Saturday. This time, he noticed the choice as he made it. That was new. When she showed up, there was no surprise on either of their faces. Just a shared acknowledgement that neither of them had rushed their morning for reasons they didn't yet understand. They worked side by side again, exchanging a few more words than before. Small observations. Comments about the stubbornness of certain routes. The unpredictability of weather. Ordinary conversation. But underneath it was something quieter and heavier. Attention. Not the kind that demands or consumes. The kind that simply notices. How she paused when her wrists needed rest. How she smiled slightly when something worked the way it was supposed to. How she didn't fill every gap in conversation, but also didn't disappear into it. He realized slowly that he felt more present around her than he had felt in a long time. That realization frightened him more than attraction ever could. Presence meant awareness. Awareness meant choice. And choice meant responsibility. For what he wanted, for what he might hope for what he'd been avoiding by keeping his life small and manageable. There's an unspoken rule many people live by: if you don't want too much you can't be disappointed. He had built his life around that rule. He noticed how she asked questions, not invasive ones, not probing. Just thoughtful pauses followed by curiosity. When he answered, she listened without reshaping his words or steering them somewhere safer. She let silence do some of the work. It felt respectful. It also felt unfamiliar. Most people rushed to fill gaps. She didn't. At the end of the morning, they walked out together. Not because they planned it, but because neither of them rushed ahead. They stood near the gate for a moment, the day opening in front of them, neither quite ready to step back into their separate routines. They talked about getting coffee sometime. Not as a plan exactly, more like a possibility placed gently between them. He went home feeling unsettled again, but this time, the feeling stayed. Over the next few days, he noticed patterns he hadn't paid attention to before. How often he defaulted to agreement instead of expression. How quickly he dismissed ideas that felt risky, even internally. How rarely he asked himself what he wanted beyond what felt reasonable. That kind of self-awareness doesn't arrive all at once. It shows up in fragments. In moments when something small feels heavier than it should. In reactions that surprise you with their intensity. He found himself anticipating the next Saturday. Anticipation wasn't something he made space for. It implied expectation. And expectation had once led to disappointment he'd learned to avoid. Still, it was there, quiet but persistent. When they finally sat down for coffee weeks later, it didn't feel like a first date. There was no performance. No urgency. Just two people sharing time without trying to define it too quickly. He liked that. He liked how nothing was being demanded of him. But something else was happening beneath the surface. She was present in a way that gently exposed his absence from himself. He noticed how she spoke about her days, not dramatically but honestly. How she acknowledged when something disappointed her, instead of brushing it aside. How she allowed herself to want things without apologizing for it. It made him aware of how carefully he filtered his own desires. When she asked him what he hoped for, even casually, he felt a pause stretch inside him. He answered with something safe. Something vague. Something that wouldn't commit him to growth or change. She didn't push. She just nodded, as if filing the information away, not as judgment but as understanding. That restraint made him comfortable. And comfort, to him, had always felt like success. This is where many people get confused, though they rarely realize it in the moment. Comfort can be a sign of safety. But it can also be a sign of avoidance. He mistook the ease he felt around her as proof that everything was right. He didn't yet understand that ease can exist alongside imbalance, that one person can be stretching while the other is settling. As the weeks passed, their lives began to overlap more naturally. Walks turned into meals. Meals turned into long conversations that drifted without urgency. They didn't rush labels. They didn't collapse into each other's lives. On the surface, it looked healthy, mature, balanced, and in many ways, it was. But growth doesn't always move at the same speed in two people. She was slowly leaning into possibility. He was slowly anchoring into familiarity. Neither of them was wrong, but they were moving in different emotional directions without realizing it. He liked how she fit into his life. How she didn't disrupt his routines. How being with her didn't demand immediate vulnerability. He believed this was what adult love was supposed to feel like. Calm, steady, uncomplicated. What he didn't yet question was whether love should only ask you to stay comfortable. There's a quiet educational truth buried in moments like this. The patterns that once kept us safe can eventually keep us small. He didn't see the pattern yet. He just felt content, relieved, proud of himself for finding something that didn't hurt. And because nothing hurt, he assumed nothing was wrong. That assumption would shape everything that followed. Because love, when it's real, eventually asks a question comfort cannot answer. Are you willing to grow, or are you only willing to stay? He wouldn't face that question yet. Not today. But it was already waiting for him, quietly, in the spaces he hadn't learned to explore. If this chapter felt familiar, if you've ever been tired without knowing why, if you've ever told yourself nothing is wrong while quietly feeling disconnected from your own life, you're not alone. This story is for anyone who has confused comfort with peace, and stability with fulfillment. If you're enjoying this kind of emotionally honest storytelling, take a moment to like this video. It really helps stories like this reach the people who need them most. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson for stories that don't just entertain, but reflect real life, real love, and real lessons we're all still learning. Before we move on, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever felt emotionally tired even when life looked fine on the outside? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Your story might help someone else feel seen. He didn't think of what was happening as the beginning of anything. Beginnings felt dramatic, and this didn't. There were no racing thoughts, no sudden shift in his routines. Life stayed mostly the same. The same job. The same apartment. The same calm, predictable rhythm he trusted. The only difference was that something inside his days felt slightly more awake. They didn't see each other every day. Sometimes a week passed without contact. When they did meet, it was usually simple. Coffee after the garden, a short walk before heading home. Nothing that demanded preparation or explanation. That ease mattered to him. It told him he was safe. He liked that she didn't ask too much. Or at least, that's how he understood it at the time. She didn't press for constant communication, didn't seem offended when he needed space, didn't fill the air with expectations. She showed up when they agreed to meet, fully present, then returned to her life without clinging. It felt balanced, adult, reasonable. And yet, beneath that balance, something more subtle was happening. She paid attention, not in a way that made him feel examined, but in a way that made him feel noticed. She remembered small details he forgot he'd shared. She asked follow-up questions weeks later, not to test him, but to understand him better. When he spoke, she didn't interrupt to relate it back to herself. She let his words land. That kind of listening was rare. It made him slow down without realizing he was doing it. He chose his words more carefully around her, not because he felt judged, but because he felt heard. Silence didn't feel like absence when she was around. It felt intentional. That was new. Most people rushed through pauses as if they were something to escape. She didn't. She seemed comfortable letting moments breathe. It made him curious about what she was thinking, though he rarely asked. Curiosity, he'd learned, could lead to expectations. Expectations led to disappointment. So he kept his interest quiet, controlled. She, on the other hand, seemed willing to sit with curiosity without rushing to conclusions. Sometimes she would say things simply, without cushioning them. Not harshly, just honestly. If she was tired, she said so. If something made her happy, she didn't downplay it. He noticed how little energy she spent pretending. That unsettled him more than he admitted. He had spent years smoothing himself down to fit comfortably into the world. Watching someone exist without that constant self-editing felt both refreshing and risky. There were moments, small ones, when he felt an urge to lean forward emotionally. To say more than he usually did. To admit uncertainty instead of offering something polished. Those moments scared him, so he redirected them. He talked about work instead of feelings, about logistics instead of longings. She didn't challenge the redirection. She noticed it though. He could see it in the way her eyes lingered for half a second longer than usual, as if she were gently marking the distance. They never talked about what they were doing. That omission felt mutual, but it wasn't equal. For him, not naming things felt like protection. It kept everything manageable. If there were no labels, there were no expectations. If there were no expectations, nothing could demand more of him than he was ready to give. For her, not naming things felt like patience. She believed clarity came with time, and she was willing to let it arrive naturally. Those are two very different reasons to wait. On one of their walks, she asked him what he enjoyed most about his life. It wasn't a heavy question. She asked it the way people ask about favorite foods or weekend habits. Still, it caught him off guard. He paused longer than he meant to. Enjoyment wasn't something he'd thought about recently. Satisfaction, yes. Stability, yes. But enjoyment required a different kind of honesty. He answered with something safe. Routine. Consistency. Knowing what to expect. She nodded, accepting the answer without argument. But later, when she spoke about her own life, she mentioned wanting things that stretched her. New experiences. Emotional depth. Growth that felt uncomfortable but meaningful. He listened carefully. He didn't realize it then, but this was the first quiet sign of misalignment, not in values, but in direction. He admired her openness. He truly did. But admiration didn't automatically translate into willingness. Watching someone move toward growth is different from choosing it yourself. As the weeks passed, he began to associate her presence with relief. Being around her softened the edge of his emotional fatigue. The heaviness in his chest eased when she laughed, when she spoke thoughtfully, when she shared space without demand. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask what it meant that she made him feel more alive. Instead, he folded that relief into his understanding of comfort, and told himself this was what love looked like when it was mature. Quiet, steady, undemanding. What he didn't yet understand was that love doesn't just calm what hurts. Sometimes it reveals what's missing. And as their connection deepened gently, without fireworks or declarations, he remained unaware that he was already defining the relationship in a way that felt safe to him, but incomplete to her. This is one of the hardest lessons in adult relationships. Two people can care deeply for each other, and still be loving different futures. Neither of them saw it clearly yet. But it was already there, growing slowly in the spaces between what was said and what was avoided. As their connection settled into something familiar, he began to relax in ways he hadn't expected. Not the kind of relaxation that comes from excitement or anticipation, but the kind that comes from predictability. He knew roughly when he'd hear from her. He knew what their time together would feel like. There were no emotional spikes, no sudden demands. It was calm, measured, easy to maintain. That ease mattered to him more than he realized. He had spent years learning how to manage himself so life wouldn't feel overwhelming. He kept his emotions within reach, but rarely let them spill. He organized his days carefully, making room for responsibility but not for uncertainty. When something felt too intense, he instinctively stepped back. Not because he didn't care, but because intensity had always felt like a warning sign. She didn't live that way. She didn't seek chaos, but she didn't avoid depth either. When something moved her, she acknowledged it. When something disappointed her, she didn't bury it under logic. She didn't rush to fix her feelings or make them smaller so they'd be easier to carry. He noticed the difference in small moments. Once, while walking together, she mentioned something she had hoped for that didn't work out. She spoke about it calmly, but honestly. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't downplay it. She simply let the truth exist between them. He listened, then responded with reassurance instead of understanding. He told her things worked out the way they were supposed to. That disappointment faded. That stability mattered more than longing. She smiled politely, but something in her expression shifted. He didn't notice it at the time. What he offered was comfort. What she needed was presence. There's a difference between soothing someone and standing with them. Comfort smooths edges. Presence allows complexity. He had mastered the first without ever learning the second. As they spent more time together, he found himself appreciating how little she asked of him. She didn't question his silences. Didn't demand vulnerability on a schedule. Didn't push for definitions or timelines. To him, this felt respectful. To her, it felt temporary. She believed patience was part of love, but not the whole of it. She trusted that, eventually, clarity would come. That emotional honesty would grow naturally, the way it often does when two people care enough to keep leaning toward each other. She didn't realize yet that he wasn't leaning forward. He was settling in. That difference is subtle, but it changes everything. Settling feels like relief. Leaning feels like effort. One evening they cooked dinner together at his place. The apartment was clean, organized, almost sparse. Everything had its place. She noticed how careful he was, how nothing seemed out of order, not just the space, but himself. When she asked how long he'd lived there, he answered easily. When she asked if he ever thought about changing it, moving, redecorating, making it feel different, he hesitated. "I like knowing what to expect," he said. It wasn't defensive, just honest. She nodded. She didn't argue. But later, alone, she would think about that sentence more than she expected to. Knowing what to expect had once felt safe to her too. Until it didn't. As the weeks went on, moments like that stacked quietly. Not as red flags, not as warnings, but as information. She began to notice how rarely he spoke about the future unless prompted. How his answers stayed general when she asked about hopes or plans. How often he framed things in terms of what he was willing to do, rather than what he wanted. He didn't avoid her questions. He just answered them carefully. Careful answers feel thoughtful, but they can also hide fear. He, meanwhile, felt increasingly convinced that what they had was good. Better than good. Healthy. He didn't feel anxious around her. He didn't feel pressure to perform. He didn't feel like he had to be anything other than steady and reliable. He believed this meant he was doing something right. There's a common misunderstanding in adult relationships. If something feels calm, we assume it's balanced. But calm can exist even when two people are carrying very different emotional loads. She was slowly offering more of herself. Not dramatically, just incrementally. Sharing stories that mattered. Letting him see her doubts. Naming things she wanted, even when she wasn't sure they'd happen. He received those offerings with kindness, but not with reciprocity. He listened. He reassured. He stayed. But he didn't reveal much more of himself in return. He didn't notice the imbalance because he equated staying with loving. He believed that consistency was proof enough. That reliability meant commitment. That being there, physically and predictably, should count for something. And it did. Just not for everything. One afternoon, as they sat together in the garden, she mentioned how much she valued people who were willing to grow, even when growth felt uncomfortable. She didn't say it pointedly. She said it the way people talk about values they've earned through experience. He felt a quiet resistance rise in him. Growth to him sounded like instability, like risk. like reopening doors he'd worked hard to close. He didn't want to dismantle the life he'd built just to feel something more intense. Intensity had once cost him peace, so he stayed quiet. Silence, he believed, was neutral. But silence is never neutral when something important is being offered. She didn't push the conversation further. She never forced depth where it wasn't freely given. That restraint was part of her care. She wanted him to choose openness, not feel cornered into it. Still, with each unspoken moment, something subtle shifted. She began to feel like she was waiting. Not waiting for attention or affection, but waiting for intention. And waiting, even patiently, can become lonely when you're doing it alone. He sensed the change before he understood it. A slight distance. Less spontaneity. Longer pauses between moments that used to flow easily. He told himself it was natural. That relationship settled over time. That the initial lightness always faded. He didn't ask what it meant. Because asking would require him to listen to answers he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. This is where many relationships quietly turn. Not in conflict. Not in betrayal. But in unacknowledged divergence. Two people moving at different emotional speeds, both believing they are being considerate, neither realizing that care without alignment can still lead to loss. He felt safe. She felt uncertain, neither of them named it yet. But the space between comfort and love was slowly becoming visible, and once you see it, it can't be unseen. By the time they began spending more intentional time together, it felt less like something new, and more like something that had simply settled into place. There was no moment where they decided to cross a line. No conversation about exclusivity or direction. Their connection deepened the way habits do, gradually, almost unnoticed, until it became part of the rhythm of their lives. They started seeing each other on purpose, not just by coincidence. A shared meal after long days. An evening walk that stretched longer than planned. Sitting side by side on the couch, not talking much, just existing in the same space. To him, this felt ideal. There was companionship without pressure. Presence without demand. He liked that she didn't rush him. He told himself that meant she understood him. What he didn't recognize was that patience can look identical to acceptance, until it doesn't. She was careful with him in a way that came from experience. She didn't overwhelm him with questions or expectations. She paid attention to what he offered and adjusted accordingly. When he shared something personal, she received it gently. When he stayed surface level, she didn't punish him for it. She believed people opened at their own pace. But she also believed that pace should move. There were moments when she almost spoke up, small openings where she could have asked for more clarity, more vulnerability, more intention. Each time she chose to wait. She didn't want to force something that needed to grow naturally. Waiting, she told herself, was an act of respect. He experienced that waiting as freedom. He liked knowing that he could show up as he was, and not be asked to stretch beyond it. He felt trusted. He felt accepted. Those feelings mattered deeply to him. They reinforced the belief that what they were building was healthy, even mature. Yet beneath that comfort there was a quiet imbalance forming. She was learning him. He was fitting her into the life he already had. The difference was subtle, but important. When she spoke about her past, she didn't dwell on it, but she didn't hide it either. She talked about lessons she'd learned, mistakes she wouldn't repeat, ways she'd changed. She framed growth as something ongoing, not something you completed and set aside. He listened attentively. He respected her openness. But he rarely offered the same depth in return. When he spoke about his life, he focused on facts. Timelines. Responsibilities. Things he'd handled well. He talked about who he was now, not how he became that way. He kept his stories tidy, as if emotion were something that could be edited out without consequence. She noticed, not as a flaw, as a pattern. She began to understand that he valued control, not in a domineering way, but in a self-protective one. Control over his time, his emotions, his expectations. He didn't like surprises, especially emotional ones. That made her careful. She found herself measuring how much of her own emotional world she brought into shared moments. She didn't want to overwhelm him or make him feel inadequate. So she paced herself, even when she felt more deeply than she showed. This kind of self-adjustment can feel like love at first. But over time, it costs something. One afternoon, they sat across from each other at a small cafe, the noise around them muted by familiarity. She asked him casually what he wanted his life to look like in 5 years. Not as an ultimatum. Just curiosity. He paused. The question made him uncomfortable. Not because he didn't have answers, but because he didn't like articulating them. Naming the future made it real. And real things could disappoint you. He gave a careful response. Stability, balance, continuity. He spoke about maintaining what he'd built rather than expanding it. She listened quietly. Her own vision included movement, learning, change that felt purposeful. She didn't need constant upheaval, but she believed stagnation could be just as damaging as chaos. She didn't argue with him. She didn't correct him. She simply filed the information away, the way you do when something doesn't quite align but you're not ready to call it a problem. That was her strength. And her risk. They continued like this for a while, both feeling connected, both feeling safe, but for different reasons. He felt safe because nothing was being demanded of him. She felt safe because she believed more was coming. This is one of the quiet lessons relationships teach. When no one is paying attention, feeling safe for different reasons can eventually make two people unsafe together. He began to associate her with calm, with relief from the quiet tiredness he'd been carrying. Being with her eased the heaviness in his chest, even if he couldn't explain why. He didn't see that she was doing more emotional work than he was. He didn't see how often she paused before sharing, checking whether the moment could hold it. He didn't notice how she softened her own needs to keep things flowing smoothly. And, because she didn't complain, he assumed everything was fine. Love to him had always meant staying, being consistent, not leaving when things became inconvenient. He didn't yet understand that love also means reaching forward, meeting someone where they are going, not just where they've been. As they moved deeper into each other's lives, he remained convinced that what they were building was solid. She remained hopeful that it would become more. Neither of them realized that hope and comfort, when left unexamined, can quietly pull people in opposite directions. Over time, the space between what they felt and what they said began to grow, not dramatically but steadily. It wasn't distance in the usual sense. They still saw each other, still shared meals and moments, still laughed in familiar ways. On the surface, nothing had changed. But beneath that surface, something subtle was shifting. She became more aware of what she held back. Not because he asked her to, but because she sensed the limits of what he could receive. She learned which parts of herself landed easily, and which ones created silence. She noticed how certain emotions made him withdraw slightly, not physically, but internally. He didn't shut down. He softened. And softness, in his world, meant containment. He had a way of absorbing things without engaging them. When she spoke about uncertainty or longing, he responded with reassurance. When she expressed dissatisfaction, he reframed it. When she hinted at deeper emotional needs, he met them with steadiness instead of curiosity. He believed he was being supportive. But support without engagement can feel lonely. She began to ask herself quiet questions she hadn't expected to face so early. Questions about emotional compatibility, about whether care, when it doesn't deepen, eventually stalls, about whether patience could turn into self-abandonment if she wasn't careful. She didn't voice those questions yet. She didn't want to rush him or pressure the relationship into something it wasn't ready to be. She valued what they had. She respected his pace. But respect, she was learning, didn't mean silence. One evening, as they sat together watching something neither of them was really paying attention to, she leaned her head against his shoulder. It was a simple gesture, familiar, comfortable. He welcomed it. But as she rested there, she noticed something missing. Not affection, not warmth, but movement. The sense of being emotionally met, rather than simply held. She wondered if he noticed it too. He didn't. To him, the moment felt perfect. Quiet companionship. No pressure. No need to talk or explain. This was what he'd always imagined love would feel like once it settled down. That belief had protected him for years. But protection isn't the same as growth. He noticed that she was quieter than usual, but he assumed she was tired. He offered her space instead of curiosity. He believed that not pushing was the kindest thing he could do. She smiled and accepted the space. But something in her shifted. It wasn't disappointment yet. It was awareness. Awareness has a way of changing how you experience even the most familiar moments. Once you see a pattern, you start noticing it everywhere. She began to notice how often she adjusted herself to meet him where he was, and how rarely he did the same in return. Not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know he was being asked to. He had never learned how to recognize those requests. His life had taught him that if no one was upset, things were fine. That absence of conflict meant presence of health. That as long as he stayed, he was doing his part. She had learned something different. She had learned that love erodes not when people leave, but when they stop moving together. She began testing small truths, naming things gently, mentioning hopes without turning them into demands. Each time, he responded kindly, but cautiously. He acknowledged her words without letting them reshape him. That restraint felt responsible to him. To her, it felt like a wall. This is the part many people miss when they think about emotional mismatch. It doesn't require cruelty or neglect. Sometimes it's simply two people using different definitions of love without realizing it. His definition centered on comfort and consistency. Hers included intention and growth. Both definitions are valid on their own, but they don't always coexist peacefully. As weeks passed, she felt a quiet ache she couldn't quite name. Not sadness, not dissatisfaction, more like a gentle tension, like holding something fragile and realizing you're the only one adjusting your grip. She didn't blame him. She knew his care was real. She saw it in the way he showed up, in the reliability of his presence, in the calm he brought into her days. But care without movement can become a resting place that no longer leads anywhere. She wondered how long she could rest there without losing something of herself. He, meanwhile, felt content, relieved, proud of the way things were unfolding. He believed they were building something solid precisely because it wasn't turbulent. He didn't notice that solidity can sometimes be another word for stillness. There's a quiet educational truth in moments like this. Love doesn't always end because people stop caring. Sometimes it ends because one person keeps growing and the other keeps settling. Neither choice is wrong. But pretending they're the same leads to heartbreak. As they moved forward, both of them felt something coming, though neither could name it yet. She felt the weight of an unspoken need. He felt the comfort of things staying as they were. And somewhere between those two feelings, the question that would eventually change everything was beginning to form. Not yet spoken. Not yet unavoidable. But already waiting. What he learned to become. He didn't remember deciding to become this version of himself. It happened the way most adaptations do. Slowly, quietly, out of necessity. Long before adulthood shaped his routines, life had taught him a simple rule. Steadiness keeps things from falling apart. As a child, he learned to read rooms before he entered them. To sense tension without being told. When voices grew sharp, he softened. When emotions swelled, he shrank his own. He became dependable not because he was praised for it, but because it kept things calm. Calm became safety. And safety became identity. By the time he was grown, he no longer questioned that identity. Being the reliable one felt natural. People leaned on him, trusted him, counted on him to stay level when things got difficult. He didn't resent that role. It gave him purpose. It made him feel useful. But usefulness came with a quiet cost. He learned how to manage situations, not emotions. How to endure, not express. He learned that if he stayed present and unproblematic, things would eventually resolve themselves. Conflict passed. Feelings cooled. Life moved on. So he carried that lesson into love. When relationships became uncomfortable, he didn't leave, but he didn't lean in either. He waited. He believed patience could solve most things if given enough time. He trusted consistency more than conversation. This wasn't apathy. It was conditioning. To him, love wasn't something you chased or reshaped your life for. Love was something you fit into what already existed. Something that should feel seamless, not disruptive. That belief had served him well, until it didn't. With her, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Ease paired with awareness. She didn't disrupt his life, but she illuminated parts of it he'd stopped examining. Being around her made him notice his own emotional habits. The way he defaulted to reassurance instead of curiosity. The way he avoided naming desire. The way he equated calm with health. He didn't yet see these as limitations. He saw them as strengths. When she shared something vulnerable, he responded with solutions or comfort. When she hinted at wanting more clarity, he offered time. He believed he was protecting both of them from unnecessary strain. What he didn't recognize was that he was also protecting himself from change. There's a particular kind of fear that doesn't feel like fear at all. It feels like responsibility, like maturity, like knowing better than to hope too loudly. He had learned that hope could destabilize things. So he kept his expectations low, his emotions regulated, his life contained. And when she entered that contained world, he assumed love would work the same way everything else had, by adapting quietly. He didn't ask himself whether adaptation was enough. Meanwhile, something else was happening inside him. Despite his efforts to keep everything steady, He felt drawn toward her in ways he didn't fully understand. Not urgently, not obsessively, but steadily. Her presence softened him without threatening his structure. She didn't ask him to perform or explain himself. She accepted the version of him he offered. That acceptance felt like relief. And relief to someone like him felt like love. This is where the confusion took root. He began to associate love with the absence of tension, with not being asked to stretch, with being allowed to remain as he was. He believed that if something felt easy, it must be right. He didn't see how much effort she was quietly investing to make it feel that way. He didn't notice how often she paused before speaking, deciding which parts of herself to reveal. He didn't see how she adjusted her emotional pace to match his. He didn't realize that the comfort he valued was being carefully curated. Comfort, when shared equally, can be grounding. Comfort, when maintained by one person alone, becomes exhausting. He didn't know that yet. All he knew was that being with her felt better than being alone. That the quiet heaviness he'd carried for so long eased in her presence. That the life he'd built felt more tolerable when she occupied a space within it. He didn't question whether tolerable was the same as fulfilling. He believed love was something you preserved, not something you expanded. That belief wasn't cruel. It wasn't selfish. But it was incomplete. And it would eventually collide with someone who had learned a very different lesson about what love requires. What she learned to protect. She didn't walk into this connection unaware. She had learned enough about love to know that beginnings are generous. People show their best selves early on. They listen more carefully. They adjust more willingly. The real truth of a relationship reveals itself later, when comfort sets in and effort becomes optional. That understanding didn't make her cynical. It made her observant. In the past, she had loved with urgency. Not recklessness, but hope. She believed in leaning forward, in naming things early, in trusting that shared effort could carry two people through uncertainty. For a while, it had felt beautiful. Then it had slowly thinned. There was no single moment where it broke. Just missed conversations, deferred plans, promises that softened over time. The slow realization that she was holding the emotional weight alone while telling herself it would balance out eventually. It hadn't. Leaving that relationship had taught her something painful, but necessary. Love doesn't disappear all at once. It fades when effort isn't mutual. She didn't carry bitterness from that experience. She carried awareness. So when she met him, she moved differently. She paid attention to how he responded when things felt slightly uncomfortable. She watched whether curiosity followed vulnerability. She noticed if reassurance replaced engagement. She didn't judge him for these things. She understood them. She could see how careful he was with himself. How much value he placed on stability. How little space he gave to desire, unless it felt manageable. That level of self-control wasn't unfamiliar to her. It just wasn't what she wanted to build her future around. Still, she stayed. Not because she was afraid to leave, but because she believed in patience. She believed that some people needed time to trust that depth didn't always lead to damage. She believed growth could happen gently. She also believed in protecting herself. That meant watching her own tendencies closely. She resisted the urge to overextend. She stopped herself from carrying conversations alone. She noticed when she began to justify his emotional distance instead of addressing how it made her feel. Those were lessons she'd learned the hard way. She allowed herself to hope, but carefully. Being with him felt good in many ways. He was kind, consistent, thoughtful in the details that made daily life smoother. He remembered her preferences. Showed up when he said he would. Offered calm when she felt overwhelmed. But calm, she knew, wasn't the same as connection. Connection required engagement, willingness, movement. She began to feel the difference most clearly when she imagined the future. Not specific plans, just emotional direction. She wanted a life that expanded. A partnership where both people were willing to examine themselves and grow together. Where comfort didn't replace curiosity. She didn't need intensity. She needed intention. And intention, she was learning, couldn't be assumed. She tried small ways of expressing this. Gentle comments about growth. Casual mentions of wanting more emotional honesty in relationships. She didn't frame them as requests. She offered them as insight. He received those insights politely, but passively. He didn't resist them. He didn't dismiss them. He simply didn't move toward them. That's what made it difficult. If he had been unkind, the answer would have been clear. If he had been inconsistent, she could have named it. But he was steady. He stayed. He cared. just not in the way that moved forward. She found herself feeling strangely lonely while being cared for. That loneliness confused her at first. She questioned herself. Wondered if she was asking for too much. Wondered if adulthood simply meant accepting what worked instead of longing for what stretched you. But something inside her resisted that idea. She had learned that ignoring that resistance led to quiet resentment, and resentment, once it sets in, poisons even the gentlest relationships. So she stayed aware. She began noticing how often she imagined conversations that never happened. How often she rehearsed what she might say, then chose silence instead. How often she adjusted her expectations downward to protect the peace between them. Peace, she was realizing, wasn't always neutral. Sometimes peace was just unspoken imbalance. She didn't want to repeat old patterns. She didn't want to wake up one day realizing she'd waited too long for someone to meet her where she was going. At the same time, she cared about him. She didn't want to abandon something meaningful simply because it wasn't perfect. She believed in giving people room to grow. The question she hadn't answered yet was whether he wanted to grow, or whether he only wanted things to stay comfortable. That question lingered in her quietly, gaining weight with each passing week. She didn't issue ultimatums. She didn't rush decisions. She allowed time to reveal what words could not. And time, slowly but honestly, began to show her the truth. He wasn't withholding love. He was defining it differently. Understanding that didn't make leaving easier. But it made staying without change impossible. By the time they acknowledged what they were to each other, it felt less like a decision, and more like an admission. There was no dramatic conversation, no carefully chosen moment. It happened one evening when they were sitting together after dinner, the room quiet in that familiar way that had become their norm. The question surfaced casually, almost accidentally, as if it had been waiting long enough to feel safe coming out. She said she liked him. Not with excitement, not with fear, just honesty. He felt a rush of relief he hadn't expected. Relief, not joy. That difference mattered, though he didn't recognize it at the time. He nodded, smiled softly, and said he felt the same. The words came easily because they didn't require expansion. They didn't ask for promises or plans. They simply confirmed what already existed. To him, naming it felt like stabilizing something that was already working. To her, naming it felt like opening a door. She waited, not outwardly, but inwardly, for what might come next. For curiosity, for intention, for movement. She didn't expect a declaration. She expected direction. What followed instead was continuity. Their routines stayed intact. They still kept their own apartments. Still moved through their weeks independently. Still met without urgency or expectation. On the surface, this looked healthy. Two people choosing each other without losing themselves. But choice, she was learning, needed to be renewed. He took comfort in how little changed. It reassured him that he hadn't disrupted the balance of his life by letting her in. Love, he believed, should fit smoothly into what already existed, not demand reconstruction. He felt proud of the way they were handling things, slow, respectful, grounded. He believed this was what maturity looked like. She felt something else. Not disappointment. Not yet. But awareness. She noticed how the label didn't shift his emotional posture. How his affection remained steady but contained. How naming the relationship hadn't invited deeper conversation, only affirmed comfort. She didn't confront it. She observed. There's a quiet truth about naming things. A label doesn't create intention. It reveals whether it was already there. She began to notice the gap more clearly now that it had a name. The way she leaned forward emotionally while he remained anchored. The way she imagined growth while he protected equilibrium. Still she stayed patient. She told herself that clarity unfolds differently for everyone. That he might need time to feel secure enough to expand. That his steadiness wasn't indifference. It was learned survival. And she cared enough to give him that time. He, meanwhile, felt settled. The relief he felt after naming the relationship deepened into contentment. He believed they had arrived at something solid. Something dependable. He didn't sense the quiet expectations forming beneath the surface, because he didn't know to look for them. He didn't realize that naming the relationship had raised the stakes for her, not emotionally, but directionally. She wasn't asking for intensity. She wasn't asking to be consumed. She was asking, quietly, patiently, to be chosen in a way that moved forward. But he associated forward movement with risk. So he stayed where he was. This is one of the most misunderstood moments in relationships. When one person thinks clarity means we're good now, and the other thinks it means now we begin. Both interpretations feel reasonable, but they lead to very different outcomes. As days passed, she found herself checking in with her own emotions more often. Not anxiously, just honestly. She paid attention to how she felt after spending time together. Whether she felt energized or slightly diminished. Whether she felt seen or simply accommodated. The answers weren't alarming. But they weren't reassuring either. He noticed none of this. He felt calm, secure, proud of what they were building, or rather, maintaining. He believed love once found was something you preserved. She believed love, once named, was something you nurtured. Those beliefs hadn't collided yet. But they were on a quiet path toward each other. After the relationship had a name, life settled even further into predictability. They fell into patterns that felt almost automatic. Certain days of the week became theirs. Certain meals, certain routes, certain ways of ending the night. The familiarity brought a sense of ease that he cherished. He liked knowing what to expect. Liked that nothing felt urgent or unstable. To him, this was success. He had always believed that the best relationships were the ones that didn't disrupt your life too much. The ones that blended in quietly, like furniture you'd owned so long you stopped noticing it, but still relied on every day. He didn't realize how dangerous that metaphor was. She noticed the settling too, but it landed differently in her body. At first, she appreciated the steadiness. It felt grounding after relationships that had been inconsistent or emotionally draining. There was safety in knowing he would show up. That he wouldn't disappear when things got uncomfortable. But slowly, something else emerged. The comfort stopped feeling spacious. It felt contained. She began to notice how rarely he initiated conversations about them. Not because he avoided her, but because he seemed satisfied letting things be. When she brought up thoughts about the future, he responded kindly but vaguely. He spoke in generalities, as if specifics might corner him into expectations he wasn't ready to carry. She wondered if he noticed how often she was the one opening those doors. When she shared hopes, he listened. When she shared fears, he reassured. But he didn't add much of his own. He didn't meet her disclosures with disclosures. He didn't build on them. He absorbed them, smoothed them, and let them rest. That pattern began to feel heavy. Not because he was doing anything wrong, but because she felt alone inside moments that were supposed to be shared. There's a particular loneliness that comes from being emotionally safe but not emotionally met. It's subtle, easy to dismiss. But once you feel it, it's hard to ignore. She started asking herself quiet questions. Was she asking for too much? Was this what healthy adulthood looked like, choosing peace over passion, stability over depth? Or was she slowly shrinking herself to fit a space that didn't want to expand? She didn't jump to conclusions. She didn't accuse. She paid attention. He, meanwhile, felt increasingly confident in what they had. He believed consistency was proof of care. He believed staying steady meant he was doing his part. He didn't see how often she adjusted herself to keep things smooth. He didn't see how much effort it took for her to remain patient. From his perspective, the relationship worked because it didn't demand more than he could give. From hers, it worked because she was giving less than she was capable of. Neither of them named this difference yet. One evening, she almost did. They were walking together, the air cool and quiet. She slowed her pace slightly, choosing her words carefully. She thought about telling him how much she valued growth in relationships. How important it was to her that both people kept moving, even when it felt uncomfortable. But when she glanced at him, she saw how relaxed he looked. How at ease. How settled. And she hesitated. She didn't want to disrupt that calm if it wasn't necessary. She didn't want to be the one introducing tension where there had been none. So she swallowed the words and told herself there would be a better moment. That moment never came on its own. This is how misalignment often grows. Not through neglect, but through hesitation. Through good intentions that delay necessary honesty. Through silence chosen out of care. Over time, she felt herself pulling back in small ways. Less spontaneous affection, shorter check-ins. Slightly more distance between what she felt and what she shared. He noticed the change, but misread it. He assumed she needed space. He gave it willingly, believing that was the supportive thing to do. He didn't realize that space wasn't what she needed. She needed engagement. But engagement required him to move beyond comfort. And comfort was where he felt safest. This is the quiet tragedy of their dynamic. He believed love meant not causing disruption. She believed love meant being willing to risk it. Neither belief was wrong. But together, they created a slow drift neither of them could fully stop. She began to feel the weight of an unspoken decision forming inside her. Not a conclusion. Just an awareness that something would eventually have to change. She couldn't stay indefinitely in a space where her growth waited on someone else's readiness. He felt none of this urgency. To him, everything still looked fine. And because nothing looked broken, he didn't think anything needed fixing. He didn't know yet that love doesn't always break loudly. Sometimes it simply runs out of room. Sometimes love doesn't fall apart. Sometimes it simply settles into a shape that no longer fits. If this chapter felt uncomfortably familiar, if you've ever stayed because things were fine, while quietly feeling like something was missing, you're not imagining it. This story explores the difference between being cared for and being emotionally met. And that difference matters more than most people realize. If this story is speaking to you, tap the like button so more people can find it. And if you value stories that reflect real relationships and real lessons, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson for more thoughtful, emotionally honest storytelling. I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever confused comfort with love, or stayed longer than you should have because nothing was wrong? Your experience might help someone else find clarity. By the time she became certain something was wrong, nothing had technically changed. They still saw each other, still shared meals and routines, still laughed in familiar ways. From the outside, the relationship looked steady, even enviable. There were no visible cracks, no obvious conflicts. But inside she felt a growing unease she could no longer ignore. It wasn't dissatisfaction with him as a person. She admired his steadiness, respected his reliability, trusted his intentions. The unease came from something quieter, the sense that she was standing still while wanting to move, and that he was content remaining exactly where he was. She began noticing how often she edited herself. She shortened stories that carried emotional weight. She softened language that might invite deeper conversation. She delayed questions that mattered because she didn't want to introduce discomfort into something he clearly valued for its calm. That kind of self-editing requires energy. Over time it left her tired in a way she recognized too well. She remembered how exhaustion had crept into her past relationship. Not through conflict, but through the effort of holding things together alone. That memory made her pay closer attention now. She didn't want to repeat old patterns under a different name. So she started testing honesty in small ways. She mentioned feeling uncertain about where things were headed. She spoke about wanting emotional growth in relationships, even when it felt uncomfortable. She didn't frame these things as demands. She offered them as truths. He responded kindly. He always did. He reassured her that things were good, that they were solid, that there was no rush to define or change what was working. He believed his calm responses were stabilizing. He didn't realize they were also deflecting. There's a difference between reassurance and engagement. Reassurance says, "Don't worry." Engagement says, "Let's understand this together." She needed the second. He offered the first. From his perspective, her growing restlessness felt confusing. He didn't see it as dissatisfaction with him, he saw it as anxiety about the future. And anxiety, in his experience, was something you soothed, not something you followed. He believed patience would resolve it. So when she spoke about feeling unsettled, he encouraged her to relax into what they had. When she questioned whether comfort was enough, he reminded her of all the ways they showed up for each other. He listed consistency like proof. He didn't realize that listing effort can sometimes shut down the very conversation it's meant to support. She began to feel unheard, not because he ignored her, but because he translated her questions into problems to be managed instead of truths to be explored. That translation created distance. She stopped pushing. Not out of resignation, but out of awareness. She could feel herself reaching the edge of what patience could hold. She didn't want to issue ultimatums. She didn't want to force him into growth he didn't choose. But she also didn't want to disappear inside the relationship. He noticed the change in her energy but misunderstood it. He assumed she was processing something internally. He gave her space, believing that was respectful. He didn't realize that space at this point felt like avoidance. This is one of the quietest forms of misalignment. One person moves closer when things feel uncertain. The other steps back to preserve calm. Both believe they're acting out of care. Neither realizes they're moving in opposite directions. She began to imagine what it would look like to speak plainly, to ask him whether he was choosing growth or simply enjoying comfort. The thought made her chest tighten. She didn't want to corner him. She didn't want to frame love as an obligation, But she needed clarity. Clarity, she knew, would change things no matter what he said. That realization scared her more than the possibility of losing him. Because loss was painful, but staying while shrinking felt worse. He, meanwhile, remained convinced that time was on their side. That the longer they stayed together, the more secure everything would feel. He believed that love, once established, naturally deepened without requiring conscious effort. That belief was about to be tested. The misalignment between them wasn't loud yet. It didn't demand attention. But it was no longer invisible. It showed up in pauses that lingered too long. In conversations that circled without landing. In affection that felt careful instead of curious. Neither of them wanted to break what they had. But something was already bending. And when things bend long enough without release, they eventually reach a breaking point. The distance between them didn't arrive all at once. It grew in inches. In the way conversations ended sooner than they used to. In how laughter softened into polite smiles. In the pauses that lingered a second too long before either of them spoke. They were still close, but no longer aligned. She felt it most clearly when she stopped looking forward to explaining herself. When the thought of expressing her needs felt tiring instead of hopeful. That was new, and it worried her. She had promised herself she would never again stay in a relationship where her voice felt optional. So she paid attention to her body. To the tightness in her chest when she imagined another year of things staying the same. To the quiet relief she felt when she imagined speaking honestly, even if it led to loss. To the growing understanding that love without movement was slowly draining her. She didn't want to blame him for that. He hadn't misled her. He hadn't promised more than he gave. If anything, he had been consistent from the beginning. The issue wasn't dishonesty, it was difference. Difference in emotional readiness. Difference in definition. Difference in willingness to hope. He sensed something changing, but not clearly enough to act. He noticed her hesitation, her gentler touch, the way she sometimes seemed somewhere else even when sitting beside him. It unsettled him, but he didn't know how to approach it without disrupting the calm he relied on. So he waited. Waiting had always worked before. He believed that if he stayed steady, whatever this was would pass, that she would settle back into the comfort they shared. That naming the tension would only make it bigger than it needed to be. But tension doesn't disappear when it's ignored. It collects. She finally reached a point where silence felt heavier than honesty. Where protecting the peace felt more damaging than risking it. She realized she wasn't asking for reassurance anymore. She was asking for direction. And direction couldn't be guessed. One evening, sitting across from him in the quiet of her living room, she noticed how ordinary everything looked. The familiar furniture. The half-eaten takeout. The low hum of the city outside. It struck her that ordinary moments were often where lives changed. Not in drama, but in truth. She took a breath. She didn't accuse. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't list grievances. She simply spoke from where she was. She told him she felt like they were standing still. That she cared deeply. But she needed to know whether he was choosing this relationship, or simply enjoying the comfort it provided. She told him she wasn't asking to be fixed or rescued. She was asking whether he was willing to grow with her. The word grow hung between them. He felt it immediately, the weight of it, the implication. Growth sounded like change. Like uncertainty. Like risk. His chest tightened, not because he didn't care, but because he was afraid of what saying yes would require. He heard her words as pressure instead of invitation, so he responded defensively. He spoke about how often he showed up, about consistency, about stability. He reminded her of everything that worked. He believed he was proving his commitment. What he didn't realize was that commitment without intention can feel empty. She listened quietly as he spoke. She didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. And that, more than anything, scared him. Because when she finally responded, her voice wasn't angry. It was clear. She told him she valued what they had, but she couldn't stay in something that asked her to stop hoping. She said she needed a partner who was willing to move forward emotionally, not just stay present physically. She said patience mattered, but so did choice. He hesitated. Not long. Just long enough. That hesitation told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't ready. Not because he didn't care, but because he didn't want his life to change. He wanted love to fit inside comfort, not stretch beyond it. She understood. And understanding didn't make it hurt less. They didn't end things that night. Not formally. Not dramatically. But something shifted irreversibly. The conversation had named what silence had been hiding, and once named, It couldn't be undone. She stopped trying to close the gap alone. He left believing, wrongly, that love shouldn't feel this demanding. She stayed believing, rightly, that love shouldn't require her to disappear. This is one of the hardest lessons in relationships. Sometimes no one is wrong. Sometimes timing and readiness simply don't meet. And when that happens, love doesn't shatter. It slips quietly through your hands while you're still trying to hold it. After that night, nothing returned to how it had been. They still spoke, still checked in, still moved carefully around each other, as if the relationship were something fragile resting between them. But the ease that once carried them was gone. In its place was awareness, heavy, inescapable awareness. He replayed the conversation in his mind more times than he could count. He told himself he had been honest, that he hadn't lied or pretended. He had shown up, stayed consistent, offered stability. Those things mattered. They should have been enough, and yet something about the look on her face when he hesitated stayed with him. It wasn't anger. It wasn't disappointment. It was understanding. That understanding unsettled him more than blame ever could. He realized, slowly, that she had been reaching for him long before she had spoken up. That her patience hadn't been passive. It had been hopeful. And that his calm, which he'd always believed was a gift, had become a wall. That realization didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments. In the way their conversations now felt careful instead of natural. In how silence no longer felt shared, but weighted. In how he noticed her pulling back, not to punish him but to protect herself. He began to sense what he had lost before it was fully gone. She, on the other hand, felt a strange mix of grief and relief. Grief for what she had hoped they could become. Relief that she had finally spoken the truth instead of carrying it alone. She didn't regret the conversation. She regretted that it had taken her so long to have it. She wondered how much of herself she had quietly folded away in the name of patience. How often she had chosen peace over honesty. But regret didn't mean she wanted to undo it. She had learned something important about herself. She could love deeply, and still walk away from what limited her. That knowledge gave her strength, even as it hurt. They met less frequently now. Not by agreement. By instinct. The distance wasn't punitive. It was respectful. Both of them were giving the other space to process what had been said. He found the quiet unbearable. The routines he once relied on no longer soothed him. The apartment felt too still. The mug in the sink reminded him of how little he'd questioned his own emptiness before she had entered his life. He began to recognize something painful. The comfort he had protected so fiercely no longer felt comforting. Without her presence, it felt hollow. That realization shook him. He had believed comfort was love. That safety was enough. But now, stripped of connection, comfort felt like avoidance. Like a room with no windows. Safe, but airless. He wondered if it was too late. Not to save the relationship, but to change himself. She wondered something different. She wondered whether staying in touch would slow her healing. Whether hope, once cracked, could be repaired without reopening wounds she'd worked hard to close. She cared about him. That hadn't changed. But caring didn't mean sacrificing herself again. They met once more, weeks later, by chance. A brief encounter. Polite. Warm. Restrained. The kind of interaction that confirmed what words already had. Something essential had shifted. He wanted to say more. He wanted to tell her he was thinking differently now. That he was questioning things he'd never questioned before. That her words had stayed with him in ways he couldn't ignore. But wanting to say something isn't the same as knowing how to live it. He stayed quiet. And she didn't ask. Because she had learned that clarity doesn't come from promises. It comes from patterns. This chapter of their story wasn't loud. But it was decisive. He was beginning to understand that love isn't just about staying. It's about choosing. Actively and repeatedly. She was beginning to accept that sometimes, love teaches you through loss instead of union. Neither of them had reached the end yet. But they were no longer pretending they were on the same path. They didn't sit down and decide to end things. There was no final argument. No dramatic goodbye. No clear moment where one door closed and another opened. Instead, the relationship loosened its grip slowly, the way something does when both people stop holding it at the same time. Messages became less frequent. Plans stayed tentative. Conversations remained kind but cautious. He noticed how carefully she spoke now, as if choosing words that wouldn't invite more questions. She didn't withdraw completely. She just stopped leaning forward. And without her movement, everything between them stalled. At first, he told himself this was temporary. That space was part of processing. That once the discomfort faded, they would find their rhythm again. He believed time would restore what clarity had disrupted. But time didn't do what he expected. Instead of easing the tension, it revealed something deeper. The connection had been held together by her willingness to wait. Without that effort, there was nothing pushing it forward. That realization unsettled him. He began to see moments from the past differently. Conversations where she had offered more than he'd returned. Silences he'd mistaken for peace. The way she'd adjusted herself, quietly, to keep things flowing. He saw now what he hadn't before. She had been doing more emotional work than he ever noticed. That recognition came with guilt, not sharp, not overwhelming, but steady. He didn't feel like a villain. He felt inexperienced. Unprepared. Like someone who had followed rules that no longer applied. He wondered why it had taken the threat of loss for him to see what was at stake. She, meanwhile, felt herself stepping into a different kind of calm. Not the calm of comfort, but the calm of honesty. She missed him. Of course she did. She missed the steadiness, the kindness, the quiet companionship. But she didn't miss the feeling of holding herself back. She didn't miss the uncertainty of waiting for something that might never come. She felt grief, but she also felt relief. And relief, she knew, was information. They spoke one last time, not because they planned it, but because it felt necessary. Not to reopen wounds, but to acknowledge what was already true. They met in a neutral place, neither of their spaces, as if instinctively choosing ground that didn't belong to either of them anymore. The conversation was gentle, respectful, careful. She told him she cared about him deeply, but she couldn't stay in something that asked her to stop growing. She said she didn't regret what they had. It had taught her something important about herself. He listened quietly. He told her he hadn't realized how much he was protecting himself from change. That he had mistaken comfort for commitment, steadiness for depth. He admitted he was only now understanding what she had been asking for. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a promise. It was recognition. They didn't talk about getting back together. Neither of them wanted that conversation. It would have been dishonest. Growth can't be rushed to save something already slipping away. When they parted, there were no raised voices, no tears in public, just a shared understanding that something meaningful had ended, not because it failed, but because it had reached its limit. He walked away feeling heavier than he expected. She walked away feeling lighter than she expected. Both reactions were valid. In the weeks that followed, he sat with the consequences of his choices, not punishment, just truth. He felt the emptiness he'd once avoided by keeping his life small. He realized how much he had relied on her presence to soften that emptiness without ever addressing it himself. He began to question things he'd never questioned before. Why had he equated love with comfort? Why had growth felt threatening instead of hopeful? Why had he waited until lost to listen? Those questions didn't have immediate answers. But they stayed. She, on the other hand, turned inward with intention. She focused on rebuilding trust with herself, trust that her needs were valid, that patience had limits, that love should feel like expansion, not containment. She didn't rush into something new. She didn't need to. She felt grounded in a way she hadn't before. Not because she was healed, but because she was aligned. This chapter of their story didn't end with resolution. It ended with truth. He learned that staying isn't the same as choosing. She learned that choosing herself doesn't erase love, it honors it. They had loved each other honestly, even if imperfectly. And sometimes, that has to be enough. The quiet returned quickly. At first it felt familiar, almost reassuring. The apartment settled back into its old rhythm. Mornings followed predictable patterns. Evenings stretched out without interruption. The life he had built resumed exactly where it had paused. For a moment he thought this meant he was fine. But comfort, once disrupted, doesn't feel the same when it comes back. The silence felt heavier now. Not because it was lonely, but because it was revealing. Without her presence softening the edges of his days, he noticed how much he had relied on her to make his life feel fuller without ever asking himself why it felt empty to begin with. He realized something unsettling. He had loved how she made life easier, but he hadn't loved enough to let life change. That thought stayed with him. He went through his routines carefully, almost deliberately, as if testing whether they still worked. He cooked the same meals, took the same routes, volunteered at the same garden. Everything functioned. Nothing collapsed. And yet, nothing felt complete. He began to notice how often he reached for distraction. Television that played without being watched. Music that filled silence without being heard. He recognized these habits now. Not as preferences, but as avoidance. Avoidance of feeling what comfort had once protected him from. This was new territory. For the first time he didn't rush to smooth over the discomfort. He sat with it. Let it press against him. Let it ask questions he'd never allowed himself to consider. Why had growth felt like danger? Why had emotional depth seemed unnecessary when stability was present? Why had he believed love should never feel demanding? The answers didn't arrive neatly. They came in fragments, in moments of self-recognition that were uncomfortable but clarifying. He saw how often he'd mistaken calm for connection. How often he'd equated low emotional intensity with health. How he'd avoided naming desires because naming them made disappointment possible. He realized he hadn't just protected himself from pain. He'd protected himself from intimacy. Meanwhile, she was learning something different. Her days felt quieter too, but not emptier. She noticed space opening where tension used to live. She wasn't constantly measuring her words or managing expectations. She felt more present in her own life again. That didn't mean she didn't miss him. She did. She missed the kindness, the steadiness, the way he showed up without fail. But she didn't miss the feeling of waiting, of hoping for movement that never came. She spent time reflecting, not on what he had done wrong, but on what she had learned. She learned that patience, when it silences your needs, becomes self-erasure. She learned that clarity isn't unkind, it's necessary. She learned that loving someone doesn't obligate you to stay where you can't grow. Those lessons grounded her. She didn't rush into new connections. She didn't need distraction. She focused on rebuilding trust with herself. Trust that she could recognize misalignment early, and respond with honesty instead of endurance. Both of them were growing now. Separately, he began to understand that love isn't just about what you offer. It's about what you're willing to risk. Comfort had kept him safe, but it had also kept him stagnant. He could see now how much he had avoided by staying within the boundaries of what felt manageable. This awareness didn't fix him, but it changed him. And change, when it's real, doesn't announce itself. It shows up in the willingness to feel uncomfortable without retreating, in the courage to examine old beliefs instead of defending them. He didn't know what this growth would lead to. He only knew that staying the same no longer felt like an option. Growth didn't arrive as motivation. It arrived as discomfort he could no longer ignore. Some evenings he caught himself reaching for his phone, instinctively wanting to share something small, an observation, a moment, a thought that felt unfinished without being spoken. Each time, he stopped. The absence reminded him that connection had once filled a space he never acknowledged as empty. That awareness hurt. But instead of numbing it the way he used to, he stayed with it. He began paying attention to his inner reactions, especially the moments when he felt the urge to retreat. When a memory surfaced that made his chest tighten, he didn't distract himself immediately. When a feeling rose that he couldn't neatly explain, he didn't smooth it over with logic. This was unfamiliar, uncomfortable, necessary. He realized how much emotional energy he had spent managing himself, containing feelings, regulating reactions, maintaining calm. That management had once kept him safe. Now, it felt like a barrier between him and the kind of connection he claimed to want. He thought about the conversation that had changed everything, about the word grow, about how it had sounded like a threat instead of an invitation. Why had growth scared him so much? The answer wasn't dramatic. It was practical. Growth implied uncertainty. It implied not knowing who you'd be on the other side. It implied risking disappointment, conflict, or failure. And he had spent his life avoiding those risks by staying steady, dependable, controlled. He had learned how to survive. He hadn't learned how to expand. That distinction mattered now. Meanwhile, she was learning to trust her instincts again. At first, she worried she might miss him too much, that the quiet strength she felt would dissolve into loneliness. But as weeks passed, she noticed something steady forming beneath the grief, a sense of alignment she hadn't felt in a long time. She was no longer negotiating with herself. She didn't have to convince herself to stay patient. She didn't have to reinterpret someone else's limitations as virtues. She felt free to want what she wanted without apologizing for it. That freedom didn't erase sadness, but it gave it context. She reflected on how easily she had slipped into waiting, how familiar that role had been. She recognized her own pattern, believing that love meant endurance, that patience was proof of care. She saw now how those beliefs had once kept her stuck in relationships that didn't meet her fully. This time, she had chosen differently. Not because he was wrong, but because she had grown. She carried that lesson forward gently. She didn't harden herself. She didn't close off. She simply promised herself she would listen sooner, the next time her body whispered that something wasn't right. Both of them were changing in parallel, unaware of how closely their lessons mirrored each other. He was learning that comfort can be a hiding place. She was learning that patience has boundaries. He started noticing emotional cues he'd once ignored. How his body reacted when conversations hinted at depth. How his instinct was to reassure instead of inquire. How often he avoided asking questions that might change the answer. Awareness didn't solve these habits overnight. But it gave him a choice. And choice was something he'd never fully exercised before. She noticed something else. She noticed how much lighter her thoughts felt. How her energy returned when she stopped carrying emotional weight for two. How space, when chosen, felt restorative instead of empty. She realized she hadn't left because she stopped loving. She had left because she started listening. This chapter of their lives wasn't about closure. It was about responsibility, taking responsibility for how they loved. For what they avoided. For what they needed to learn before trying again, with anyone. They didn't reach out to each other, not because they were bitter, but because growth requires room. And for the first time, both of them were willing to sit in that room without rushing to fill it. Time has a way of revealing things that emotion can't. Months passed, and the sharpness of the separation softened into something quieter. The ache dulled. The memories lost their edge. What remained was understanding, slow, deliberate understanding that reshaped how he saw his past and his choices. He began to recognize how often he had chosen comfort not because it was right, but because it was familiar. Familiarity had always felt safe. It didn't ask him to reintroduce himself to parts of his life he'd carefully organized away. It allowed him to remain competent and composed. But now, with distance and perspective, he could see the cost of that safety. Comfort had protected him from pain. It had also protected him from depth. He noticed how easily he'd mistaken relief for love. How quickly he'd settled into ease without asking whether it was mutual. How often he'd waited for clarity to arrive on its own instead of choosing it. These realizations didn't crush him. They grounded him. He started making small changes, not because he felt motivated, but because stagnation had become uncomfortable. He allowed conversations to linger longer. Asked questions he would have once avoided. Let silence stretch without rushing to fill it. These weren't dramatic transformations. They were adjustments. But adjustments, repeated, changed direction. He returned to the garden often. The work felt different now, less like escape, more like reflection. He noticed how growth there required disruption. Soil turned, roots exposed, plants relocated. Stability wasn't preserved by leaving things untouched. It was created through care and effort. The metaphor wasn't lost on him. He thought about her sometimes, not with regret but with gratitude. She had reflected something back to him he hadn't known how to see. She had named a truth he'd been living around for years. He understood now that losing her wasn't punishment. It was instruction. She too felt the passage of time settle into her life. The quiet she had chosen remained steady. It didn't shrink her world. It expanded it. She found herself more attuned to her needs, more willing to name them early instead of waiting to see if they'd be met. She didn't rush into connection. She didn't feel the need to replace what she'd lost. She trusted that alignment mattered more than proximity. When she thought about him, it was with tenderness, not longing. She recognized how easy it would have been to stay longer, to keep adjusting, to keep hoping. But she also recognized how much that hope would have cost her. Leaving had been an act of self-respect. And self-respect, she was learning, creates a different kind of peace than comfort ever could. Both of them were living differently now. He was learning to lean in. She was learning to trust herself. Neither lesson erased the past, but both lessons honored it. This is one of the hardest truths about love. Sometimes the relationship that doesn't last is the one that teaches you how to love better next time. He didn't know yet who he would become in his next relationship. He only knew he couldn't return to who he'd been. Comfort, once questioned, could never again be mistaken for love. She didn't know who would walk into her life next. She only knew she would recognize misalignment sooner, and respond with courage instead of endurance. They were moving forward now. Not together, but wiser. With time, the lessons stopped feeling like realizations and started feeling like habits. He noticed it first in how he listened. When people spoke about their lives, he no longer rushed to reassure them or smooth the edges of what they were feeling. He asked questions instead. Stayed present when conversations grew uncomfortable. Let moments unfold without managing them into something safer. It surprised him how much richer those exchanges felt. He began to understand that discomfort wasn't something to escape, it was information. It showed you where growth was happening, where truth lived. Avoiding it had kept him stable, but it had also kept him emotionally distant. That distance had once felt responsible. Now, it felt unnecessary. He started paying attention to his own impulses. The urge to withdraw when emotions intensified. The instinct to stay neutral when clarity was required. Each time he noticed those habits, he didn't shame himself. He simply paused. Pausing became his new practice. It gave him room to choose differently. He didn't suddenly become fearless. He still valued calm. Still preferred steadiness. But now, steadiness included engagement. Calm included curiosity. Safety included honesty. Those distinctions mattered. She experienced a similar shift, though it showed up differently. She became more attentive to early signals, how her body responded in conversations, how her energy changed around certain people. She no longer dismissed unease as impatience or fear of vulnerability. She trusted it as guidance. This trust didn't make her rigid. It made her clear. She allowed herself to express expectations sooner, not as demands, but as truths. She noticed how often that clarity filtered connections quickly, not because people were wrong, but because alignment revealed itself early. She didn't feel discouraged by that. She felt relieved. Both of them were learning something essential. Healthy love doesn't require endurance, it requires participation. He reflected often on how easily he had stayed in a space that felt good enough. How rarely he had asked whether good enough was fair to the other person. That reflection changed how he viewed responsibility in relationships. Responsibility wasn't about staying. It was about choosing, again and again. She reflected on how often she had waited for people to meet her where she was going. How much emotional labor that waiting required. She understood now that love didn't ask her to carry the future alone. The future had to be shared, or it wasn't partnership. Neither of them framed their past as failure. They saw it as preparation. He had learned that comfort without intention leads to loss. She had learned that patience without boundaries leads to self-erasure. These weren't lessons you forget. They shape how you move forward. When he imagined love now, it no longer looked like quiet maintenance. It looked like conversation, like willingness, like risking the discomfort of change in exchange for depth. When she imagined love now, it no longer looked like endurance. It looked like reciprocity, like growth that didn't require convincing or waiting. They didn't know if they would ever cross paths again. That uncertainty didn't trouble them. They had already given each other something lasting, clarity. And clarity, once gained, has a way of guiding you, even when the path ahead isn't fully visible. Nearly a year passed before they saw each other again. Not because either of them had been counting the days, but because time had finally done what it always does best. It settled things. The sharpness of loss had dulled. The lessons had rooted. Life had moved forward in quiet, unremarkable ways. They both returned to familiar places for different reasons. He went back to the community garden out of habit at first. Then, out of something closer to intention. Working the soil had become less about escape and more about reflection. He liked how growth there required patience and disruption. How you couldn't preserve life by leaving it untouched. That morning he arrived early, as he always did. She arrived early too. The recognition came slowly. A pause. A second look. A mutual stillness as the past surfaced without urgency or fear. There was no rush to speak. No need to perform surprise. Just acknowledgement. They greeted each other politely, warmly, carefully. The kind of greeting that carries history without dragging it behind you. They worked side by side for a while, just like before. Pulling weeds. Turning soil. The quiet between them felt different now. Not weighted, not expectant. It felt honest. When they finally spoke, the conversation didn't start where it used to. It started where they were now. He asked how she'd been. Not reflexively, but genuinely. And when she answered, he listened without smoothing or reframing. He let her words stand as they were. He noticed that he didn't feel the urge to manage the moment. That felt new. She noticed it too. She noticed how present he seemed. How his attention didn't drift when the conversation brushed up against vulnerability. How he didn't rush to reassure or deflect. She felt no need to protect herself in the same way she once had. They talked about their lives. about changes that had happened quietly, about lessons learned without dramatics. They didn't revisit old wounds. They didn't assign blame. They spoke like two people who had loved each other honestly, and learned from it. He told her he'd spent time questioning things he'd once assumed were fixed, that he was learning how to sit with discomfort instead of retreating from it, that he understood now how easily comfort could become avoidance. He didn't say this to win her back. He said it because it was true. She listened with calm curiosity, not hope, not skepticism, just presence. She could hear the difference between insight and intention, and she recognized that he had crossed that threshold. But growth doesn't rewind time. She shared how choosing herself had reshaped her sense of peace, how she trusted herself more now, how she no longer waited for clarity to arrive from someone else. They didn't talk about trying again. They didn't need to. The absence of that question said more than words ever could. There was something deeply respectful in that restraint. They finished their work and stood near the gate for a moment, the same place where their paths had once overlapped without meaning. This time, the meaning was clear. They had changed, not into perfect versions of themselves, but into more honest ones. He understood now that love isn't where you stay comfortable. It's where you're willing to move, even when it scares you. She understood now that patience isn't infinite, and it shouldn't be. They parted without promises, without regret, just with gratitude for a connection that had taught them how to love better, even if not together. They didn't walk away together. They didn't exchange numbers again, or promise to stay in touch. There was no dramatic pause where one of them almost said something that could change everything. They simply wished each other well, and meant it. As he walked home, he noticed how different the city felt now. Not brighter, not easier, just clearer. He didn't feel the familiar urge to analyze the encounter, or replay it looking for meaning. The meaning had already been given, and received. He had loved her. He had lost her. And in losing her, he had learned something essential about himself. For the first time, that knowledge didn't feel like regret. It felt like responsibility. He understood now that love isn't proven by how long you stay, but by how willing you are to change when staying requires growth. He saw how often he had hidden behind comfort, calling it peace, when it was really fear dressed up as maturity. That understanding didn't shame him. It freed him. He didn't promise himself he would never choose comfort again. Comfort wasn't the enemy. Avoidance was. He knew now how to tell the difference. He knew that when something mattered, it would ask something of him, and that answering that call was part of loving well. He would be slower to settle next time, quicker to listen, braver with uncertainty. And that mattered. She too carried the meeting with her, but lightly. She didn't replay it for signs of what might have been. She didn't wonder if timing could ever align. She already knew the answer wasn't important. What mattered was who she had become because she chose herself when it was hard. She felt proud, not in a loud way, but in the quiet way that settles into your bones. Proud that she had honored her needs without villainizing him. Proud that she had left before resentment replaced tenderness. She hadn't lost love. She had refined it. She trusted herself now, not just to love, but to walk away when love asked her to disappear. That trust was worth more than any relationship she might have saved by staying silent. Both of them continued on. Separate paths, different futures, shared understanding. They were no longer the people who had met in the garden looking for stillness. They had learned that stillness when held too tightly can become stagnation, and that growth, when avoided, finds its way in through loss. This is the lesson they carried forward. Love isn't comfort alone. Love is intention. Love is movement. Love is the courage to grow, even when it costs you something familiar. He had confused comfort with love, and lost them both. But what he gained was clarity. And clarity, unlike comfort, doesn't fade. It changes the way you love forever. Some love stories don't end with forever. They end with understanding. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of a time you chose comfort over growth, or growth over familiarity, then this story was for you. Because love isn't just about staying. It's about being willing to move when staying costs you too much of yourself. If this story helped you reflect, please like this video. It helps these messages reach the people who need them most. And if you believe love stories should teach as much as they touch, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson for more emotionally honest storytelling. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Do you believe love should feel safe, or should it challenge you to grow? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your words might help someone else find clarity today. Thank you for being here. And thank you for listening.